Hey everyone, this is Dan Caruso, Support Director here at Agency Access. Today we have Mike Warning, our Creative Director, joining us for a quick video tutorial. Pretty excited about this one. This is going to be on our new email builder, and why don't we have Mike jump right in?
All right, hey everyone. So I think the best way to show off our new builder is to just walk through the process of creating an email from start to finish. And so here we're looking at our new editor interface. And I think the best place to start is to just take a tour of the overall user interface. You'll notice on the left, we have a couple of tabs here and looks like a lot of settings. I think the best place to start is just to touch on what these settings are and why you might want to use them or how you should use them. So our first section that you'll notice here is this appearance tab. And I like to think of this appearance tab as sort of a global settings for how your email is going to be displayed. So as you can see in here, we have things like your message width, which is the width of your email, for instance, here. Default spacing, in our terminology, it's called padding. Different colors, font options, things like just general settings that you're going to want to adapt to make them match the look and feel of your brand. And by doing so here, it'll make your life easier when you're actually working and interacting with the editor, bringing in different content, because you'll set the settings here once, and anything you do moving forward will inherit those settings, making it easier for you to keep your emails looking consistent. So here is the example email that we're going to build today. This is obviously a standard, typical looking email promotion. We have this fictional photographer here, and this email contains a lot of the common components and elements that you might find in a promotional email. And so I think the best way to handle this moving forward is just to jump back into our editor and start to go through and set up the email to sort of build it that way. And so as I go through here, we'll keep our email at 600 pixels width. I think that's a good default. Most email browsers and email clients support that width without any scrolling. So it's kind of an industry standard. I would suggest leaving it there, or if you want to play with it a little bit narrower, a little bit more, a little bit wider, that's okay. But in general, around that would be a sweet spot. In our paddings here, in our template, if we go back into look here, we have a little bit more of a generous amount of space around the email. And so in this instance, in the padding area, we're going to want to bump that up. And so in our case, I'll just change these to 40 on the left and to the right. And what this will do is that once we get into building our email, once we start dragging the building blocks into the email, these default settings in here will take precedence. So I don't have to go in and every time I drag something in, I won't have to change it to be 40. It'll be 40 off the bat. It just saves me time moving forward. Okay, so this general background color, this is the background color of the page essentially. And so in our case, I just happen to know that the background color for our email is this sort of mid-tone gray. So I'll set that. Here's where I would set the default font that we want to use. In our case, our fictitious photographer uses Poppins. So I'll set that here. Line spacing, this is very similar to what you would expect to find in programs like Word. Basically, how tight or loose the line spacing is. I think the default here is fine. Whether or not we want our links to be underlined. Typically in emails, underlining links are a good accessibility, good best practice, because it lets users know that something is clickable. But of course, if you don't like that or if it doesn't match your branding, you can turn that off. Responsive design, I won't touch too much on this, but I suggest you just leave this feature on. This allows the builder to make some decisions for you automatically that allow you to make your email work correctly on pretty much all devices, from desktops all the way down to phones. So that's what that's for. Okay, so now we've got that basic area set up. I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to jump into stripes here. So stripes are sort of what I like to call the layers on a cake, in sort of that sort of a baking analogy, if you will. And our email, if you come over into this editor section, you'll see we have a stripe, and this one happens to be of the type header. We have another stripe here of type content, and we have another stripe here of type footer. These are somewhat arbitrary, but they are nice to have inside of our email because they help us organize our content, and it basically allows for us to set up these general settings in a way that will make our email at the end look a little bit more consistent. And so understanding that sort of layers analogy is important. So if we come back into the stripe section, I can open up the header. And so what the settings in here really mean is that anything inside of a header stripe, like the elements that we will eventually start dragging into this section, what do we want those to look like? Or what do we want the defaults for those options to be? And so in this case, we'll change, happen to know that this template, we want to change to 16. This is, of course, all totally configurable to your branding. We want the background color of any module, or sorry, any structure that we drag into it. We want it to be white. And in this case, we have our font color. So this is a good opportunity. So the default in here, I'm just going to go ahead and change that. I'm going to change it to this little bit more of a subtle change, but it's a change from basically a dark gray to a dark blue. So I'll change that here. And then I'm also going to, while I'm at it, I'm going to grab another bit of hex code here, and I'm going to drop in a value for our links color. And of course, in here, you have a color picker. You can select whatever you want, or you can just type in the hex value if you have one specifically and you want to go. So now that we've got the header set up, we'll just continue doing that for all the other kinds of stripes. So we will just come down to the content. In here, we'll do the same thing. We'll change our default to 16. We still want the background color of any structure we drag in to be white. And again, we will take the text color and we will do the same thing here. And why not? We'll make the links also the same color. And then one more, we'll do the footer. In this case, I think it's a nice touch to have footers have generally less prominence. And so we'll just choose a smaller font here. The background color will be transparent still here. But in this case, what we'll want to do in our template, if we just jump back here real quick, we see down in our footer here, and this is this last bit here, typically that it just ends an email. This one, we have this dark black or this dark gray background. So when we jump back into here, this is where we can set this value. And so what we'll do is we'll change this from white, which you see here. We'll just change this to the dark black, the dark gray, sorry. And basically doing so, what we'll do is, because we've changed this, obviously we won't want to keep our fonts dark gray because you wouldn't be able to see them. So we'll just change that to white. And for the purposes of the links, what we'll take is just a lighter version of the green that we've been using throughout the email. I think it's kind of important to mention that the type of the stripe is not super important in the overall layout of the email. But what it does is, obviously, because I've set up the stripes in here, and I've set that all my text in here is 16 and it's this dark blue, if I were to drag this in and start dragging a footer module into here, my footer module would inherit the styles of the stuff, the settings and the defaults that I have for the header. So I think it's just important, like if you drag other stripes in, or if you're using multiple stripes in an email, if you ever get jammed up and you're trying to figure out why some of the results aren't looking the way that they are, just look at the type of the stripe, and I'll show you that in a minute. because you'll find that maybe it's like, oh, you're expecting it to be a footer when in fact the stripe that you have selected is of the type header, that kind of a thing. So long about way of saying, I think most cases you'll be able to get away with the stock ones. And you'll see as we start building, you'll find that it's really quite flexible. All right, so now we'll jump back in and pick up where we left off. We'll look at headings. And so the headings section allows you to basically set up the fonts, the spacing, and the overall sizing of the typography throughout our email. So in our case, our fictitious photographer uses Poppin, so we'll set that here. There's an option to set line spacing independent of the normal body content. And so I find typically headlines, they're usually set in bigger typography. And so having them have a little bit of a tighter spacing is good. We can obviously play with this later, so I'll just leave it at the default. So we'll come in here and we'll make our H1. Why don't we just take this up, and because we're going to try and use this for our the name of our photographer, jumping back here, we're going to use this as a really big visual element. I'll set that to be quite large. So I've made this 72. I'm going to come back in here. I'm just going to grab our dark blue color again. And while I've got that in my clipboard, I'm just going to paste that for all my headings because I basically want all the headings to be the same color. So for H2 tag, and this is obviously dependent on your email design. In our case, here, I'm going to set both the heading 2 and the heading 3 to be 22 pixels. What we'll do is when we get into actually designing the email, we will see how we can change that. But these are good, sensible defaults. So yeah, that covers the headings. And I think the last thing that we'll touch on just right now is the buttons. And so in a buttons here, exactly like you might think, we can set the color of the button. In our case, I think we should make it this bright yellow. You can choose whether or not you want the button to have a slight subtle interaction. And by doing so, once you enable that, it gives you an extra control. So in this case, I can just plug my yellow in. And what I might do is just take this, and I might just play with it a little bit, move it up or down or something, just to give people, and what this will do is when a user hovers over that button, it'll change the background color of it just to give an indication that you're actually on the button and it is clickable. So in this case, I think we can, again, grab our text color and we'll just keep this consistent. Here's where we choose our font again. Of course, there's control if you want your buttons to have a different font. You can do so. In our case, we'll just keep it the same. I think it makes sense to keep it at 16 pixels. And then there's border radius. So border radius is you have to think about them as like rounded corners. And so if I have 0, my button will look square. If I add more, like if I increase the value of the border radius, the more rounded the corners will get. So I think for our design, I'm not even sure we're even using a button in ours, but in this instance, I think if we were going to do it in this style, I don't think we would have a border radius. So I'll just leave that at 0. The border itself, I'm going to turn off. So the border is the color of an outline of the button itself. And so this is sometimes useful if you wanted to have a lighter color button and a darker border, or sometimes you don't want the button to have a color at all. Perhaps it's white or whatever background color of your email is, and the border is just a small outline. It's kind of a minimal design element. That's how you would set this. And typically 1 pixel is good. If you want a little bit more, if you want a little bit chunkier, then 2 might be good. But of course, you can just do that to taste. And then the last kind of thing into dealing with buttons is the spacing. And once we get the email, we're starting to build these and we drag some of these elements in, we can come back in here and I'll show you what happens in these cases. So I think in our case, what this is, what we want to do is just decrease the size or the spacing on the left of and right of the text of the button. And so it's not so large, and maybe we'll just increase this. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense now, but we'll touch on it again in a minute. Okay, so we have this mobile formatting section, but I think in our case, I think it's best we start building the email and then we'll come back and we'll touch on the mobile formatting after. Okay, so let's just jump in then. So we're going to switch over to the content tab. For up until now, we've been in this appearance tab. So once you get this basically set up, it's probably not something that you come back to that often unless you want to make broad like overarching changes to your email design or your branding. But once that's all set up, we can just head over to the content. And inside of content, you'll notice how we have kind of three main sections. We have structures, we have blocks, and we have modules. And I think we've already touched on stripes basically, which we call the layers in a cake. The structures are things that we can put in each layer. And the structures allow us to organize our content. So in our case here, you can see we have a single column structure in the header, another one in our content, and then another one in the footer. And you'll just pick and choose these structures depending on the layout of your email. If you want two images side by side, or if you want an image next to some text, then a two column is good. And likewise, basically there's just a sort of all the common kind of configurations that you'd find in a typical email exist in here. So I think the first thing we'll do is we'll bring in and deal with the header here. And so because the header is a single column here, I think the module that exists or the structure in place already makes sense. So I'm going to close the structures. Instead, I'm going to open up the blocks. And if the structures are basically the organization of each of the stripes, then the blocks are the individual elements. And so our case here, we're going to want to drag in some text. So let's just drag it here. So you just click on it over here. You can see you can grab it and you just drag it into the blue area and it will add it to the structure. So in our case, we have this text here. I'm going to select it. And if you remember back to our appearance settings, we made it so that the H1 is the super big element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to the H1. And so now if I come back in here and I look in our email, it's the right size and everything kind of makes sense. So I'm just going to come in here. Let's go. We have this. And here's another example. So the H1 back in our appearance settings we had it set up as the second most relaxed line spacing. But I think in this context, when it's this large of a font, I think it may be a little bit tighter is better. So what we can do is we can just change it. And what that does is it tightens it up, but it tightens it up only for this instance of that heading. If I were to add another H1 further down in this email, it would inherit the setting that was set up on the appearance tab. So yeah, so let's just keep going here and you can start to see how quickly we can kind of adapt. So I'm just grab the text block again. I'm going to take this in here. And again, I'm going to change this. In this case, I'm going to go to heading 2. And then if we jump back into here, we've got sort of our specialties listed for this fictitious guy. So what we'll do is we'll just copy and paste this in. And then because back in our headings, we said the heading should be that dark blue color. In this case, this is a good way to override because we might want to have other headings, like we might want to have other heading 2s throughout our email be that dark blue color, and that's probably typical. But this is another instance where we can just select it and we can come over here and we'll just change it to the green that we have in our email. So what that does is it gets us our top section done. But if you notice, if we jump back in here, if we jump back into design, you'll notice there's like a little bit more space in between. So I think this is a good opportunity to just talk about spacings. And so there are a couple of ways you can do spacing. And I think depending on how particular you are with your design and your brand elements, one may be better than another. So the first option is to just click on the element that you want to add spacing to. In this case, this is the big heading 1 tag. And if you jump down and you notice in this sidebar, when you select one of the elements, you'll notice in the block, instead of just seeing the actual building blocks that you can drag in, it'll give you controls for that block. So obviously we've changed our text color already. And so in this instance, like for instance, if we wanted to change the alignment of the text, we could do that here. We've already done the line spacing, but you'll notice this section called padding. So if I see this, I've got a padding of 0. If I start to increase this, you'll see that what it's doing is it's adding, like in this case, it's adding 30 pixels of padding around all 4 sides. In our case, that's not what we want in this instance. All we really care about is having padding on the bottom to just create a little bit more space between our elements. So if you toggle this more button here, it basically lets you set the padding independently. So I can just go down to the bottom. In this case, let's just add 5 pixels of padding. And so in this case, I think that looks reasonable. And now we'll touch on another spacer element. And so, because if we hop back into our design, you notice our next element that we have here is this subtle divider that just sort of divides the header off from the rest of the content. So if I jump back in here, how would we do this? Well, I think the easiest way to deal with that is jump back to your blocks. And now in this case, we're going to bring in a spacer. And by doing a spacer, you'll see what happens is I can bring a spacer in, and by default, spacers just happen to have a border. So we can leave that and use the spacer as is. I think it makes sense. And in our case, we'll just want to tweak it a little bit. We need a little bit more space above and below it. And you can notice how this has spacing or padding on the left and right. We don't want that. We want this border just to align with the left, right of our text. So in this case, what we can do is we'll just open up the padding again. And this is an option again, when we flip the more button. In this case, we don't want any padding on the left and right. So let's just get rid of it here, and we'll get rid of it here. Now our border goes edge to edge. So the next thing we'll want to do is, in our case, I think just having a little bit more space in here gives a little bit more room to breathe. So I can just change this, and now we're kind of set. So we have our header basically set, and we're good to go. And so now that we're in our header module, you can see we're still within the header stripe. And so I think the next best thing to do is just continue on. We'll deal with the content next. And now we want to create this content here where we have a little bit of a bigger call out of a text with a smaller bit to the side. So in this case, let's jump back in. And if you jump into the content stripe now, you notice how we just have this one column here. So this isn't going to help us in this instance. In this case, we're going to want the 2-column structure. So let's just drag that in. And just be sure that when you drag it in, you're dragging it into the correct stripe. And so in this case, I'm hovering over the content stripe, and I can see that I've done that. And then it's basically a little bit more of the same. So in this case, I'm going to drag some text into here, and I'm going to drag some text into here. And then what I'm going to do is I just have this in my clipboard from our design, and I'll do the same here. I'm just going to copy it just for the sake of time. And I'll come back in here. And we have the basics of this section. So in this case, I think we'll want to change this to a heading 2. And this is the example where we have this as a heading 2, and we changed it. This happens to be all caps and in the green. This is our default styling, which kind of makes sense for this layout. So what we'll want to do in this case is, you notice how, like, when I was back up in here, I added 40 pixels of padding to the bottom of the spacer. You'll find often when you're building emails that you'll get the spacing or the padding for different elements and different structures. They start to combine, and you'll end up with bigger spacing than you actually really want. So there's really no magic solution to this. It's just that in this case, I'll find, like, up here, if I'm going to just say, this structure, for instance, has 20 pixels of padding on the bottom. I can leave that there. This spacer block that we drag in, we added 40 pixels. And then if we look down here, the structure for the next one inside the content section has 20 pixels on the top. So it's really up to you how you combat this. I think in our case, what we can do is just take this spacer block that we dragged in, and let's just remove some of that. So I'm just going to actually bring this all the way down to 0. And so by doing so, everything starts to tighten up and it looks a little bit more like our design. The next thing I would do in here, because I find that maybe perhaps this content here in the left column and the right column are a little bit close together. So again, I would just use padding to help us. So I click more to get access to our padding control. And in this case, I want to add some padding to the right of it. And what that'll do, you'll notice as I add it, it's basically adding an invisible amount of space here that forces the content in there not to consume that area. And in our case here, it just makes it a little bit more easy to read, and it just creates a little bit more of a visually pleasing kind of structure. Okay, so now we'll get into one of these areas where I think, and that is, we'll add another spacer in here. And in this case, and the reason why we want that spacer, as I'll show you in a second. So back over on our spacer controls, once I have this, again, just to reiterate, once I'm selected on one of these elements, I have the controls for that element over here. So if I click back over on our spacer, the top thing in this block is kind of a really cool tool. And if you click it, what it does is it removes the border, and the padding and anything that you have set in here doesn't matter anymore. Instead, in the editor itself, it gives you control where you can just change the padding for any amount that you want in here. So in our case, the reason why we would want this, and this isn't an extreme example, but in our case, it's nice to have the bottom of this text, the baseline of this text, aligned so that it's so that, for instance, if this, well, here's an example. If we just took a little bit more and we made this bigger, this might be a situation where this kind of looks weird. Maybe we want this text to be bottom aligned. So we just grab this spacer up here and you can just arbitrarily change that until it aligns the way that you want it. And I think that's a good use of those spacers. And you'll find that oftentimes when you're trying to create a little bit more interesting layouts, these dynamic spacers will become kind of your best friend because they're really, really flexible. And obviously you can see they're quite easy to use. Okay, so now that we've got that section set up, we jump back into our email here. The next thing we want to do is actually some of our imagery. So again, this is kind of very similar. You'll notice here we have our 2 images, and we have just a space in the middle that's separating them. So if we jump back into here, we won't use that structure. Instead, we will open our structures, we will grab another one, and we will drag this structure in. And so now it gives us a place to drag our next images in, or our next blocks. So we jump back over to blocks, just like we did with text. We can drag and indicate what we want in that block. So in this case, we're going to grab 2 different images. And then when you click on the image, you'll notice over here in the section that updates to give you control over your content, you have this area where you can grab your images. And so in this case, I'm just going to browse to my desktop, and let's just find that image. When you do it, it's going to load the image, and there we have it. We have the image loaded in that column. So what we'll do is we'll just do the same thing for the next one. We'll come here, we'll go, and might as well show you in your desktop, when you browse, you can just go to your folder, and then you can just grab the image you want and drag it in. And doing so basically just adds it. And here's another instance where if we look at our design, we have this spacing above. And so I think, again, this is the perfect use for this spacer block. So I'm going to go back to our blocks. I'm going to grab the spacer block and I'm going to throw it right on top of here. And again, it comes with the border, which we don't want. But if we switch it to dynamic spacer, we have control now. So what I can do is I can just bring this down, and you'll notice basically the way I like to do it is if you're ever trying to align something like this, as you start to drag down and you get close to the bottom, what I like to do is look at the next section down. And as I adjust here, I'm going pixel by pixel. So if I get to the point where I'm seeing the next section move down 1 pixel, I know that I've gone too far. So, and that makes sure that, so like 65 in this position basically makes it so that our content is totally aligned. And so it's a great way to do that. So let's just jump back. We'll do one more here. We're going to, and I should say really quickly, instead of jumping back over to the block section here and dragging something in, when you hover over the structure, an empty structure, you kind of have the most common elements you'd want here. So there is the text, there's a button, and the one on the left is an image. So if I select that, it basically does the same thing as me dragging one in. So in this case, I'm just going to go back to my folder and I'm going to grab the last image here. This will go full width, and now we're cooking. We have kind of our layout starting to look like something. And so we are in good shape. All right, so now that we have our three main images, if we hop back into our design, we'll notice that we have one more sort of image structure here. And this one's a little bit different. This one goes edge to edge. In other words, it doesn't have a border. And also, unlike these other images up top here, this image actually has text and other elements above it. So if we jump back into the editor, we can do a couple of things. So first of all, we'll drag in a single column structure, because that's really what we want to do is we're going to drag it into the bottom of our content stripe. Just like we set up our defaults to set the spacing so that everything is consistently spaced. In this case, we don't want that. So we're just going to go ahead and negate these values on the left and right. I'm going to turn this all the way down to 0. And I'm going to turn this one down to 0. And this is a good option. And in this case, I think we'll turn it off on the top too. So rather than change them all, I can just flip this toggle back. And then with the value that I specify here is the value that's specified everywhere. So once we're clicking on this option now, instead of dragging any images in like we did with these top images, instead we want what we call a background image. And if you notice, after I have that selected over here, we have an option to select a background image. So if I do so, I happen to have this uploaded already. So I'm just going to select that image. And now you notice that you don't really see that anything has happened. And that's just basically because the this blue area that's a drop zone essentially for your content is just placed on top of our image. So in our case, if we hop back to our design, we notice that we want some text here, follow me, and then we have our social links. So in this case, we'll just jump back here and we'll just use this handy option here. We'll add some text. And now you can see, well, maybe not see, but it did add some text here. So I'm going to select it and I'm going to turn this into a heading 2. And in this case, it's inheriting the dark blue color that we've selected. But in this case, we want to override it. This one, we want it to be white. So I'm going to come over here into the text color area, and I'm just going to select white. So I can just come to the selector, bring it all the way to the top, or if I happen to know the value, which case I do here, I'm going to select that here. Then we also notice how the text is left aligned. And so in our case, flip back to our design, we want it to be center aligned. So that's just as easy as coming to the alignment section and setting the alignment here. This is another great opportunity to talk about these spacers again, because in this instance, the background image itself, the structure is really only going to be as high as the content that's contained inside of it. So because our text isn't very big, and let me just update this to what it will be. We need a way to create some space and make this module a little bit taller. So we will use the spacer module again. We'll bring it in here and we'll just drag it in. Sometimes it's a little tricky, especially when a module is this thin, but you'll see that if you just take a minute and carefully place it, you'll get it in there. This is another option or another case where we don't want the border. We just want the actual spacer to consume some space. And so in this case, we want it to be quite large. So maybe we want to come up to like something like 112 or whatever it would be. And in this case, we also want that to be on the bottom. So we could just come back in, drag another spacer, but we've already set it up. And so if you come over and click on the empty area here, the spacer itself, if you hover over to this area on the right, you'll see that there's some additional controls. We can delete a module here. We can move it if we wanted to change its position. And then we have this duplicate function. So if we have copy function. So if you copy it, you'll see it just places it right below. So what I'll do is we have these two spacers. So that's basically what the space we want above and below the image. And so what I'll do is I'll grab this one, and now that I'll move this one right to the middle. So now we have the spacer, we have our text block, and we have another spacer. And now that we can actually see our image, we notice that like that's probably not the crop that we want on that image. And so it's important to remember that background images aren't really designed to be an element that is totally predictable. Just by their nature, they will expand and contract, or rather, they will consume the space that's available to it in a way that works differently than the images in here. So we have a couple of different options for these. So if we just jump back here, I'm going to just use this handy to container feature. And basically, this is a navigational element that sometimes is easier to use. And this is because we have elements like this spacer block, we have a text block and another spacer block that happens to be sitting on top of our container. And you notice our container here. So I could click container here, which would bring me up one level or deeper in the hierarchy of this structure. But if I ever get lost and I'm trying to figure out why I can't do something, if you notice this area over here in the sidebar, it says to container. And so if I click this to container, now I can see all my container controls. And then if you notice how this changed now, it will change to structure, and I could just jump back up and change the padding on the structure or whatever. Just you have to think of this as the nesting of the hierarchy of how this the HTML is actually built out. So when I'm in here, you'll notice a couple things. So we have the background image, obviously, that we've set. We want to probably, in this case, we probably want it to align to center, and you can see what I did there. And then you have these position controls. So position controls are the X, Y. So we've said the X, Y is in the center. So in this case, the image is going to be centered within this 600 pixels width, and it's going to start at the top. Most of the times, I think, with background images, it's probably nicer to have it center. And really what that does is it makes it so the focal point, typically, the middle of the image is what's going to be seen no matter what size your email is displayed. And this is kind of important for when we get down to phones, when we're thinking about mobile design, because the focal point would change, and maybe the point of interest of that image is in the middle. But if we had it set to top, even though on desktop here, it's big enough and we could see it, when we get down to a phone, you might lose it. So I find that center is generally a good tool or a good setup for this. And you'll find that it probably just reacts the way that you expect it to. Okay, so now we're cooking. We've got our spacer on top, we have our text here, and then another spacer to give us kind of some height here. So the last thing we want to add to this structure, and we'll jump back to our block section, is this really handy social block. So if we just grab this and drag this right below our type, now you can see we have some options. It brings in some social icons by default. And of course, this is all completely configurable. And this is a really powerful feature. I know that our members have been asking for this kind of functionality for some time. So we're really excited to showcase it. what's really nice about this is that we have all of the most common social platform icons available for you to select. And so in this case, if I, right now we have Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube that come in as defaults. If I didn't want YouTube and I only had the two, then I can just use this delete little icon and get deleted. If I wanted to add one, I just come up and there's this little plus icon that says add icons. When I do that, it brings up, like I said, like all the most common. So here's X, there's Pinterest, there's anything you would want. LinkedIn, popular one, Dribbble, Behance, basically anything that you'd ever want. The other options that exist is that we have chat, which are kind of like more common, like platforms for like teleconferencing. Obviously, you'll see things like Messenger in here and Skype. And then you have others, which are kind of like general, but these are often useful. For instance, like generic email icons or generic phone icon. If you want to have an icon that someone can click on to just dial you from their mobile, these icons really come in handy. So in our case, I'm just going to jump back here and maybe I'll just add a Vimeo link. And so we have these three links in here. And so not only can we just pick the icons that we want or the platforms that we want, we can change the way that they look. And so in this little control here, if you drop it down, maybe we don't want the colored ones, or maybe we don't want rounded corners. Maybe we want to switch to, sort of boxed, more squared off ones. So you pick that. Maybe you want outline ones, which is like this. Maybe not good on this design because it's a little hard to see, but you can see there's all sorts of options in here. There's grayscale ones, black and white ones. So for kind of any sort of aesthetic and look and feel, I think that you'll find that there's something for everyone. In addition to specifying the style of the icons, we can choose the spacing in between. So we have obviously a more tighter condensed spacing. We have a little bit more relaxed, and then we have or sort of a sizing. Sorry, I meant to say sizing here. So we can change the sizing of these icons from small, medium, and large. And then what I was talking about is the space in between. Down here is where this is called indent between icons. If you just change this amount here, you can create the space in between. I suggest typically somewhere between 25, 30. And it maybe just looks a little bit big on desktop, but the nice thing about it is that when you get down to phones or people on tablets, it's nice to consider them. And so having the icons spaced a little bit further apart just allows people, when they're clicking on things with their finger, that they don't hit the wrong one by accident. It just saves a little bit of aggravation. And so what we do to make these things work, now that we've got them in here, you'll notice there's a link for every icon that we have in here. So of course you just paste your Facebook link in here, your Instagram here, and your Vimeo link here, and you'd be good to go. If, for instance, you didn't want to link to a site, if we had some other text, perhaps it wasn't an icon, and we wanted to link to something else, and we'll cover this when we get to the footer, but the options for linking here, you'll see, are pretty varied. So like if you want to link to another site, obviously you'd pick site. If you want to send an email or have a link that when someone clicks on it, it opens up their email program, that would be this mail option. Telephone, if you want someone to click on a link and have it dial a phone number, this would automatically do that for you. So when you put this option here, for instance, telephone, you just type in your phone number, and it would make it so that when someone clicks on it, it would just automatically dial, especially if they're on mobile. This is a great feature that often comes in handy. So yeah, so that's basically looking good. And what we'll probably do is, because if we jump back in here, and even though we've made them smaller here, let's make them, we'll try to match this a little bit. So what we'll do is we have a little bit more space in between here. So again, we have a couple of options to do that. We have the padding option, which like we've clicked on this text, so we can click on the more, and we can add padding to the bottom of it, which is good. Or if I didn't want to do that, I can turn that off. And if I really wanted to, and if it made more sense to you, and maybe you prefer to work this way, you can just drag another spacer in if you wanted to, and then come into here, back over into this area, turn the dynamic spacer toggle, and now you can have control over here. So the one caveat about this is that, and this is handy and it sometimes comes in useful, is that the one thing to consider is, and when we get to mobile, we can, I'll show you that sometimes the padding option is a little bit more flexible. So just trust me on that right now. When we get into controlling the mobile view, we'll deal with it. So in this case, I don't want this spacer anymore. I'm just going to click on this little icon here and I'm going to delete it. And instead, I'm going to click on this text. I'm going to go back over here and let's just add maybe 10 pixels, maybe 15 pixels. And then maybe we'll come here and we'll make these 24 to maybe make it look a little bit more similar to our design that we're working towards. Okay, so this is great. So we've got our basic structure here. And now let's think about our footer. So we hop back in here. We can see, again, our content's laid out in a 2-column fashion. Let me just grab some of this text to make it easier. Let's go reproduce this. So in this, we have a 1-column module. That's, in our case, that's not going to help us. This is just what comes when you start a blank template. So in our case, let's just go back and we are going to drag in a 2-column option. And now when we do this, we might as well just delete it. We don't need this anymore in this case. Or actually, you know what? We'll probably use it if you think about it, because we do have this one section here at the bottom that will go 1 column, or will stretch the full width of the email. So let's just keep it for now. So in this column, again, we're going to add some text and we want it to say, let's work together. Going to come back here. We're going to change this to the heading 2 that we have. And because we're in a footer, we have that our headings had a default color, but because we're in the footer, it doesn't really make sense to have the dark gray. So we're just going to come in, we're going to override it for the footer here. So we're going to change that. And then what we have is, if we hop back in, we have our contact information. So we have an email and we have a website. So what we'll do is we'll just hop back to our blocks. We'll grab another text element. We'll just put it right below the other one. Simple as that. And in this case, we will add it here. And then what we'll want to do is probably just change this to match our footer styles. This one happens to be A2, 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 which is kind of a medium gray. And you can kind of see what we're dealing with there. And before we get too far, we've put that in there, but basically this is just text right now, but really we want this to be a link. So what we'll do is we'll select this text up here, and then we'll come in and we will hit this change link option. So when we do that, it adds this text, or it makes it a link and opens this side to, and it conveniently just sets the mail to value to whatever I have selected in text. So oftentimes that's what you want, but there are other times when maybe this text isn't the actual email. It maybe isn't hello@jamesnelson.com. It might be just a website or contact me. And so this is an instance where when this says contact me, you would come into this and then you would specify the mail link here. If you want to have a pre-filled subject line for when someone clicks on that email, maybe it's useful for tracking purposes, you could put that in here. And basically that's good to go. So in this case, this is where the link color came in. If you remember, we set this up in global settings, and that might be useful. Most of the time, like if we had something in a link in our text here, we might want it to be that green. But in our case, if we flip back to our design real quick, I think it looks cleaner without it. So we're just going to change that back. We're going to override this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to link color, and we're going to go A2, A2, A2. And similarly, inside of the content of our email, we may want our links to have an underline. But in our footer, our design says we don't. So what we'll do is we'll just turn off it. So we can just click this little link here. This is underline link, this toggle button. And now we have a link that looks like our mockup and functions as a mail to link. So what we'll do next is, again, we could drag another text in if we want to refer back to our design. Now we want to link to our website. So in this case, rather than dragging it in and resetting up all those colors, I'm just going to duplicate it. And basically that just takes what we have and makes a copy of it below. So in this case, we don't want it to be a mail to link. So I'm just going to remove this copy. But here's the example. So even though I've changed this text, you can notice here it's still set up to be the same thing. In fact, this right now is set up so that it doesn't matter what the user would click on, they would both do the same thing. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll take this link here and we want to change this. We want this to be a site. So when we do this, we have to just put in our URL. So in this case, it would be jamesnelson.com. The title is James Nelson. And now when someone clicks on that link, everything kind of just would work as you would expect. You'd get to where you want it to be. Okay, so what we'll want to do as we start to look at our design a little bit more, we do have this amount of spacing at the top here. And so we will come back and we'll just deal with that. So really what we want here is we want to either add in a spacer to create that space, or we want to deal with padding like we've done before. And so in this case, this is kind of a unique situation where sometimes you have to add elements to your emails that maybe don't make sense, or it's like an extra little piece, but it just gives you the flexibility to control it. And so in this case, if we added a spacer above this text, let's work here, the spacer would only be in this left column. We wouldn't able to have a full width in this, whatever we put into this right column eventually. In our case, it will be the logo. It won't get put down the same. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll just go back, we'll grab another structure, and above this two column structure, we'll just put another structure here. And this structure will not contain anything other than a spacer. So what we'll do is we'll come back in, we'll grab our spacer block again, we'll drag it into here. And of course, we don't want our border to be seen. So we'll come back here. And in this case, what we'll do is, why don't we just use this as an example of not using a dynamic spacer, but using the padding. So now that we've got our padding in here, what we'll want to probably do is just increase the top and bottom on this to give it a little bit more space. Maybe we want to do 40 and 40. So that's looking pretty good. And while we're at it, if we want to come back to our design, you'll notice how we have a little bit more space in between these elements. Let's clean that up now too. So we'll click on our type here. Again, we'll flip this toggle so that we can control each of the values for the padding for the top, left, right, top, and bottom separately. And in this case, we only want on the bottom. So what we'll do is we'll probably create 10 pixels there. And then we'll just go on to this next one element. We'll do the same thing there. So we'll scroll down to the padding, and we will, maybe this one doesn't need to be so dramatic. We just want to create something like that. So now that we've got that ready to go, the last piece is we need to bring in our logo. So we want our logo here. So we click an image because we want the image to be in here. And now we need to go find it. So we'll just come over here. We've got our logo here. And so now it's going to bring this in. But you're like, whoa, 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 this is like way too big. What's going on? So obviously we can control the size of the logo. The size here is just in increments. Like you can just use this control to bring it down to the size that you want. And then there's some alignment controls. So if in our case, for instance, we want it to be right aligned to the right of the email. So what we'll do is we'll come in here and instead, maybe just make this a tad smaller. Actually, maybe that's fine. And then what we'll do is we'll flip this and we'll take this and put it to the right. And so now we have that structure. Everything is kind of like how we want it. And then the only other thing to consider, and I might kind of gloss over it now, but there's this option for responsive image. And basically what that does is, I'll talk about it right now, but then we'll come back to it. So what responsive image does is if this is enabled and it's enabled by default, what it will do is it will scale the image to what it thinks is going to look ideal on smaller screens, especially when you get down to a tablet and to a phone. In this case, we don't want the logo to scaling up because it's really going to remove or it's going to be out of scale with everything else. So in this case, if you uncheck this responsive image, then what's going to happen is the size that I specify here, in this case 70, when I flip to another size, like on a phone, it'll stay 70. And I think that's key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it back so that when we actually start working on, like we're really close now, once we start working on the mobile layout, you'll really start to see how that comes together. All right, so now that we have this content laid out, the last piece of our footer is to include this little bit of content down the bottom. And so what we'll do is we have this, if you remember, we left this single column structure here. So what we'll do is we'll select text here, and I've got it on my clipboard. So we have this link here. We'll probably want to make that the same color as our footer text. I think that'd be nice. And then in this case, I think we want that text to be a little bit smaller. So we'll just come up to the toolbar here and maybe select something about like so. I think that feels good. Last thing to do is just link this so that it turns it into a link. And then the last piece of our puzzle here, it's a small detail, but we have a small border on it. So again, we could just use one of the handy dandy spacers. We can bring this in here. We'll put it in between here. And in this case, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to just pick a value that's maybe something like, let's try something like this. That looks pretty good. And then what I'll do is I'll just remove, flip this toggle, and I'm going to remove the left and right padding. Oops. And now we kind of have our divider. So things kind of look pretty slick. So now that we're good, let's hop back to our email. Looks like pretty good. Oh, we forgot one element. We've got our sort of yellow spacer at the top. And we just throw that in, and then we'll move on to what it looks like in mobile. So we have our structure here. And this is a one column, but this structure has that spacing on it. And because we want our bar, our little yellow detail here, to go full width, well, the best thing to do in this case is to just drag in another structure. So right at the top of the email, we'll drag a structure in. And in this case, again, we'll use a spacer module or a spacer block. So we'll drag a spacer into here. And what we want to do is first in the structure, we want to turn off all of the padding. And inside of the block now, I'm clicking on it and I'm on back to my spacer. What we want to do is we want to turn this into a dynamic spacer. And now we want to change the background color of the block. And so in this case, we can pick the yellow, and now we can use this to bring it up and just make it kind of whatever we want. In this case, it's probably something similar to that. And there's our sort of basic email coded, ready to go. So once we're happy with it, of course, as you're working and you're getting used to the editor, one handy thing to do is just come up and you'll notice a preview button up here. What this does is that if you click it, it'll give you a preview of what the email is going to look like. And of course, desktop kind of looks like exactly like we built it. But then you come over here and you see the phone version. So you can say like, oh, yeah, looks okay, but this is, I think we could do better. So if you remember back in the beginning, when we were talking about appearance, right down at the bottom of the appearance tab, there's a mobile formatting option. And so in here, this is the option. So if you remember when we went through headings and we went through the size of the content text and the footer text, all that kind of stuff, we set its default sizes and all that kind of behavior. And so in this case, what we can do is we can change it for when the emails get displayed on phones on its smaller sizes. And so back up in the heading section, our big headline here is 72 pixels. Down in the mobile formatting, we can change that. And so right now it's set at 30 pixels. And if we preview again, you can see how it's much smaller, but that's not really what we want. We still want it to be fairly big. So what we can do is just come down here and we can just change this, and 72 might be a little too big, but maybe we want something, maybe like 56. So if we preview again, yeah, maybe that looks more in line with what we want, so that kind of makes sense. So as we inspect this email in mobile view here, we can find things that we'd like to change. And so our headlines are centered automatically on a phone, and I think that's a fairly common design pattern. So I think we'll leave that. But then if you notice this text here, which is the text that's in the left column, and keep in mind, all of this happens automatically for you. So you notice any of the two column layouts will automatically get stacked one on top of one another, which is a very common email best practice. But in this case, this text here that we have that makes sense to have left aligned here, it kind of looks weird. We have this center aligned text here, and then we've got this left aligned text here. So what we can do, and this doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the formatting in the appearance tab, but when you're on that actual element, if you notice, next to a lot of these controls, you'll have this little phone icon, and we didn't touch on it, but this is where it comes in really handy. So what we're saying in this one, if we inspect this kind of control here, is this content is left aligned. If we just hit this for mobile layout button and it turns green, or it highlights green, then you can see we have a separate option. So in this case, we can hit center. Nothing changes here because we're looking at the desktop version. If we click this back, you can see now we're left aligned. But now when you come into preview and you preview it, now you can see our text is now centered on the phone. And that's exactly what we want, because now everything is centered. It kind of flows more naturally. And I think that's a really good design pattern. So taking this a step further, we have, actually, let's just jump back into that preview for a second. So when these images stack, here's our their image structure, the two column, if you remember. And because on phones, things are stacked one after another, you'd be like, whoa, there's like a lot of space here. And on desktop, it made sense to have that spacer in here because that's what created the bottom alignment. But because they aren't shown in a two column configuration anymore, that space seems unnecessary. It ruins the flow. So what we can do is we can come back here and we'll just click on this spacer. And then here's another cool feature. If you look right down at the bottom of this section, you'll see hide element. And this is pretty interesting. So right now it says hiding no. So what this spacer element is going to be shown on phones and on desktops. If I choose to hide it on desktop, then you'll notice you get this little thing here that shows, and if you hover over it, it'll say hidden on desktop. And really what that means is that even though we can see it while we're building it in here, if I was to preview it, you would see now that spacer's gone and it's basically right to the top. So in this case, that's not really what we want. In this case, we don't want it hidden on desktop, but we do want it hidden on mobile. So we just click this little phone here, you'll see this little icon and you'll see the little phone thing with a line through it. And if you hover over it, as a reminder, it'll just tell you that it was hidden on mobile. So you won't see it here, but if you hop into the preview, what it'll be now is that space that we had there is no longer there. And it naturally flows because we don't want that, flows right into the next image. And now our images flow in the right order, 1, 2, 3. So that's a really kind of handy feature. It'll take probably a little bit getting used to, just to wrap your head around when something is shown, when something is not. I like to just suggest that if you ever question it, you'll see this little yellow mark here. And if you see that, you'll know what that means. And if you click on it, you'll see where it's actually hidden. And if you click on it again, you come back, if you want to change its behavior, you can do it using this hide element. Okay, let's jump back into preview and see what else we need to do, if anything. So this handles this nicely for us. And of course, if we wanted to control the space or the sizing of this this text here, we could do so. Or the spacing in between here, we can control that separately using that padding. So why don't we do that? This is a good example. So we want to control this. So now we're on this spacer module. So just like with what we did with this control, if we're on this spacer module, we have this top value of 40 pixels. Well, if 40 pixels seemed a little bit too much on a phone, like maybe we're pushing our content down too much, we can just click this toggle button here. And on phone, right now it's defaulting to 40 because that's what we had on desktop. But maybe we want this to be down to 20. So let's just change that down to 20. And now if we preview that, you can see our line is much closer. And then you're like, okay, well, now we have this extra space here. Maybe we want to tighten that up. So if we come back to our layout here, you'll notice in the top of this structure, in this top of the structure, we have 20 pixels. So in here, it makes sense because that's how it looks. But maybe if we want to come in, we'll just toggle, click that phone, and maybe we'll remove that so that there is no top spacing on this structure in phones. So when we preview it, we can see that it just tightens everything up. And now it's just a much more condensed version for phones. And so, as you can see, you can play with these options to your heart's content. You'll have total control over how the email is displayed on desktop and on the phone. So let's continue down. We'll look at everything here. You can see our background image is still centered like we talked about. We have the proper spacing. And then we get into this area where this looks a little sloppy, and I think we can do we can make some improvements here. So in this case, we probably want this text to be centered. And like we mentioned before, we probably want that logo not to be scaled to the full width of the phone. So what we can do is we'll just come back into here. And first things first, what we'll do is we can come up to this this container here, because the other thing is when we preview here, we'll notice like there's like an unnecessary amount of space in here. Like there's just too much, and so we might want to tighten that up. So what we'll do is we'll click on that spacer or on that that spacer, and what we'll do is we'll use this toggle again. We'll flip to the mobile view. And you can see in the top and bottom, we have 40 and 40. That's what gives us our big height. So we can just change that. Let's just bring that down, maybe even to not too much. And we'll do the same thing here. Maybe a little bit, probably need a little bit there. So we'll do that. Let's jump back in real quick, preview it. And yeah, that seems a little bit better. So then what we can do is the next thing we'll want to do is fix this centered align text. And just like we did with the other section, is we have this alignment control. So I've selected the text. Now I'm over in the side panel. I'm looking at the alignment. I notice that it's aligned left on desktop. I'll click for mobile layout and I'll change it to center. And then I might as well, while I'm at it, I'll do the same thing with this next one. So I'll come over here, there's desktop alignment, again, toggle to the phone, switch it to center aligned. And now again, if we preview, we'll come through here and we'll see this text is nicely centered now, which looks a lot nicer. But we still have this giant logo that we want to deal with. So if you remember before when I was talking, I mentioned that responsive option, and that's where this comes into play. So with that selected, which is enabled by default, the editor will scale the image to fill the size that it has to deal with. In our case, we don't want that. We want the logo to stay the same size because it feels a little bit better. So we'll just turn that off. And now if we preview it, you'll see that in this case, you'll notice now that we have our logo the right size, but it's not sized correctly. This is in the wrong spot. So let's just close out of here. And what we do is, if you remember when we were setting up this container, we told it that we wanted to align to the right. And for desktop, that does make sense. So again, we'll just check this phone icon. And for desktop, we want that, or for mobile rather, we want it to be center aligned. So now we come back and preview. Now everything is kind of aligned here. This kind of makes sense. And so we have our unsubscribe to deal with. But one other interesting feature, and this is kind of an advanced feature, is let's just go back into here. And when we have this content, when we're previewing it, the stacking order is always going to be left and then right. So in this case, we have our content, let's work together, and our contact information on the left, and we have our logo on the right. In this instance, it's almost backwards. I feel like sometimes it might be nicer to have that logo on the top. And so there's really a nifty feature here. If you click on the actual structure itself and you come down and you'll find this option that says containers inversion on mobile. If you click that, you won't see anything here. But what will happen is it'll change the order in which things are displayed. So if we hop into the preview, now when we come down here, you'll notice now our logo's on top, and then our things work together, or our content below. And so the last piece before we wrap it up here is just to grab this last bit of text here. I'm going to again flip over to mobile view. I'm going to click center, and then I think we'll be happy now. If we come into our end result, we see everything is center aligned. The flow is pretty good. We still have our icons in place. We have a flow that makes more sense here. And now our last bit of content is completely centered. So we've taken a little bit of time to go through here to demonstrate, but in reality, building emails in the new editor, once you get a grip of the tools that are available, is really, really quick. And as you can see, I mean, it gives you immense control both on layouts for desktop and for mobile. So I think our members will be really happy with this upgrade, and I'm excited to see what they can build with these new features.
Okay, so that sums up our video for today, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time to watch. We appreciate Mike taking the time to jump on with us. Should you have any further questions, you can always reach out directly or check out our help center at help.agencyaccess.com.